All right, welcome everyone to our second webinar on defending truth. I'm Nat Nasworth. I'm Executive Director of American Values Coalition, where we are growing a community of Americans empowered to lead with truth, reject extremism and misinformation, and defend democracy. So a lot of our focus at American Values Project is on the disinformation and political extremism coming especially from right-wing media sources. But we also know as well that there are information silos and disinformation coming from the left. And our author today discusses some of that. So we may get into some of that today. So today we'll be talking about the book called The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. And to talk about that, we have the author, Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan Rauch is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the author of several books. And we also have with us as a discussant to talk about the book, Pete Wehner, Senior Fellow at Ethics and Public Policy Center. And he's also a writer for The Atlantic and the New York Times. And his most recent book is The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. Just for your calendar, our future webinars are on January 19th at noon Eastern. We will have Elizabeth Newman, who is former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at DHS and National Security Contributor for ABC. And she will be talking about political extremism and what to look for and what to do in your own communities about political extremism. And then in February, we don't have a date set yet, but in February, just looking ahead, we will have Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum talking about their book, A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. If you are live tweeting or post tweeting about this event, please feel free to tag us. Our Twitter handle is @OurValuesNGO. All right, so Jonathan Rauch. Well, so just to give you the format, so Jonathan will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes to giving a summary of the book. And then Pete is going to come in and ask some questions and engage with Jonathan about the book. And then we'll open it up to questions. At that time, you'll be able to just put your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom. And I'll look at those questions. And we probably won't get to all of them, but I'll try to get to as many of your questions as we're able to. All right, Jonathan, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Nap. Thank you, Pete, old friend, for being here. Nap, I'm a friend and supporter of the project that you all are launching. It could not be more important. So I'm glad if I can help. And Pete, I should thank you now publicly. I don't know that I've had the opportunity for actually helping with the book. You looked at some chapters, you made it smarter and wiser, as you always do, except today, when, of course, you'll fall on your face. There's a term that we've all seen in just the last couple of years, epistemological crisis, or as I call it, epistemic crisis, amounts to the same thing. It is a mouthful. It is not something people ever used to talk about, but now we hear it from people like, for example, Barack Obama. And it refers to the increasing split in our society, not just of what we believe is true and not just of our account of the facts, but of where we believe truth comes from and where we believe we get facts. We're seeing what makes this a crisis. I mean, after all, Americans have always disagreed about everything. That's the nature of our republic. It's the nature of any free society. Nor is it new that people believe a lot of weird conspiratorial stuff. That's as American as apple pie. A quarter of Americans believe in astrology, and most believe in creationism, and 40% believe in demonic possession. And I'm an atheist, so frankly, some of the stuff that mainstream Christians believe sounds pretty weird and conspiratorial to me. That's not particularly necessarily a crisis, because if those beliefs are pro-social and if they don't interfere with our ability to govern ourselves as a society, they help us live, actually, and they become a source for the way that we can have intellectual diversity, which leads to truth. The problem becomes when people get so divided over facts and truth, the governing becomes a serious problem. And we're there now. When you've got over 60% of the Republican Party believing that the election was stolen in 2020, when in fact it was probably the cleanest election ever, when they believe that Donald Trump is the rightful president, might even become president at some point in the near future. These beliefs are fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracies. We've also got another aspect of it, which is widespread chilling. It's on university campuses, it's also on social media and in real life. 60% of Americans now say they're reluctant to state their true opinions on politics for fear of causing offense or having bad social consequences. A third across the ideological spectrum, not just on the right, say they're worried about losing their job or job opportunities if they tell the truth about politics. These things are both deeply unhealthy for governing a society and being intellectually free. So what's going on here? The Constitution of Knowledge is the most rich and complex book that I've ever written. I cannot really do more than give you some bumper sticker ideas to set the table. But there are three ideas that I like to try to leave people with. I'll state them, and then I'll elaborate on them very briefly, and then we'll go to Pete in conversation. The first idea is it's not just a marketplace of ideas, it's a constitution of knowledge. The second big idea is you're being manipulated. And the third big idea is they're not 10 feet tall, we are. So take those in order. For any society, it's very difficult to come to a common account of truth for public purposes because of disagreement, because of many biases, cognitive biases, which are wired into us, which make it very hard for us to see our own mistakes, make it very easy to go down social rabbit holes with people who agree with us. Most societies have turned to versions of cultism, authoritarianism, oppression, warfare, become attached dogmatically to their errors as a way of just holding the society together. That's the first 200,000 years of human history, and it led to oppression and war and ignorance. We did something very different, starting around the time of the scientific revolution, but really taking off, about 200 years ago, 250 years ago, the time of America's founders, by doing something similar to what America's constitutional founders did, which is saying, you know what, instead of having a monarch, a king, a priest, an oracle, we're going to have a system of rules in which anyone can participate. We're going to depersonalize it. We're going to decentralize it. In the case of the US Constitution, we said we're going to force people to compromise in order to get anything done. That's going to bring in multiple factions and ideas and create a dynamic system in which people and ideas balance each other. Constitution of Knowledge, very similar, built by some of the same people, does very much the same thing. It takes a world of conflict over ideas and channels that into a process that turns conflict into facts. It's remarkable when you think about it. But if you ask Americans how we do that, they'll usually say, well, marketplace of ideas, free speech, best ideas rise to the top. Turns out that's not true. Free speech is not enough. In an unstructured environment, you get something like Twitter. You get people who are communicating not in order to exchange ideas, but in order to display, to show their loyalty to their tribe, to insult the other side, to get famous by using conspiracy theories or being trollish. What you need, it turns out, is, as with the US Constitution, you need a lot of structure. You need institutions and norms that help us be our better selves so that we frame ideas in ways that other people can check them, and then we do that work. In order to make knowledge, I have to subject my ideas to Pete and to Knapp and to millions of others who are going to look at them and criticize them in a structured way. And we do that through institutions like the big four of what I call the reality-based community. Academia, science research is number one. Number two is fact-based journalism, the world I'm from. Number three is law, very much fact-driven and fact-finding. Just ask Donald Trump what happened when he went to court with fake election claims. And number four, the government. Very important that government be fact-based. It took decades to evolve the institutions and norms, and they're very demanding. There are things like you have to go to school for years to get the credentials. You're going to have to master arcane vocabularies, learn ethics codes, understand how to do experiments, how to frame articles. You're going to have to go through peer review and editors and fact checks and many stages. If you're a lawyer, think about all the protocols you have to learn. This system takes a tremendous amount of discipline, as well as insisting on a tremendous amount of freedom. It's freedom of speech, but it's also discipline of fact. You need both. That creates an opportunity for the system's enemies, and it has had enemies since the time of the Catholic Church locking Galileo under house arrest. That brings to your being manipulated. It turns out that it is quite easy to weaponize the kinds of cognitive vulnerabilities that the Constitution of Knowledge protects us against. That's always happened. There's nothing new about it, but it's been turbocharged by social media. What am I talking about? Without getting too much into the weeds, two big variety of things. The first is mass disinformation campaigns. This is Stephen Bannon, Trump's advisor, who famously said, the real enemy is the media, and we know how to deal with them. We flood the zone with shit. You don't need to censor in order to suppress truth. You can just flood the zone with false information, conspiracy theories, half-truths, exaggerations, distortion, and lies. And pretty soon people don't know what to believe or who to believe anymore. They become cynical, fatalistic, they throw up their hands, and this opens the door to manipulators like demagogues, dictators, kleptocrats, people, I would say, like Donald Trump. We see this all over the world. The masters of this are the Russians. It's called the fire hose of falsehood tactic, putting out massive amounts of disinformation through every possible channel. Well, who else has done that? MAGA, Donald Trump. They have led over the past 5 years, and culminating in the Stop the Steal campaign, the most ambitious, audacious, and successful mass disinformation campaign ever waged in America by any antagonist, domestic or foreign, and done it with spectacular success because we had no immunity to the viruses they were unleashing. We were in the virological sense, sorry, I just lost the word. Naive population. We didn't know how to defend against this stuff, and it just tore through the society with the help of Fox News, conservative media, the Republican base. That leaves us in, I think, a dire situation right now. The other big form of manipulation, which just as it happens, just for historical reasons, could have happened the other way, this one is used predominantly by the left. It goes now by the name of cancel culture, a phrase that didn't exist when I started the book. But this is the use of social coercion to manipulate apparent consensus and intimidate people into silence. If you can do that, then very small numbers of people, small factions, can use these powers of intimidation, for instance, online shaming or demolishing people's professional life, to create a false appearance that they are much larger, more powerful, widespread voices than they really are. We see this on college campuses where small groups of activists basically control the conversation. We see it on social media. We see it in America generally. According to one good survey, the More in Common survey done a couple of years ago, the number of really avid progressive activists who are doing this are 8% of the US population. But by using social media and growing influence in mainstream media and in academia, they are fooling us into thinking that they are much more prevalent than they are and that we'll get in trouble if we disagree with them, which in fact, in many cases, we will. That's also a very powerful technique for manipulating the information environment. Both are going on right now. The worst of the two, the most dire of the two, I believe, is certainly the first, mass disinformation, because it's got an entire political party and media establishment behind it. But both need to be worried about. Final point, they're not 10 feet tall, we are. That is, if we get our act together. The Constitution of Knowledge is 350 years old. It has a stupendous variety and depth of institutions across the world. It's the only system that can engage hundreds of millions of minds to do something like pivot on a moment's notice and decode the genome of a new virus, put that shot in my arm. These opponents, they're trolls, they're nihilists, they're parasitical. They can't make knowledge. We can. And we have these institutions that have deep protocols and rich backgrounds in academia, law, journalism, government. But crucially, we have to defend them. we have to understand that it's not just that Americans got upset one day and these trusts began breaking down. We have to understand that for the last 40 years, but accelerating dramatically in the last 5 years, we have been, that is the reality-based community of which I'm part, we have been steadily targeted by very sophisticated actors using significant tactics of cognitive warfare to demoralize, to deceive, to disorient, and to dominate, and that these tactics work. So there's a lot we can do about them. It's actually a whole of society response that differs on many levels. But the number one thing to do is what the American Values Coalition is in fact doing right now, which is waking up to the fact that we are under an unprecedented epistemic attack, understanding the mechanisms that we can use to slow down this attack and ultimately repel it, and put people throughout society to work on that problem.
Pete?
Yeah, thank you. First, I wanted to echo what John said, Knapp, in terms of the American Values Coalition. Thanks for what you and your colleagues are doing. It's important, it's timely, it's even essential at this point, because the problem is as grave as John has laid out. Sometimes viruses create their own antibodies. I guess that's opposite the time in which we live. And I think about the American Values Coalition as sort of the antibodies in terms of this assault on truth. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and supportive of your efforts. I do want to say one thing in terms of John. And I first met John in the mid-1990s. We had breakfast together with one other person at the Mayflower Hotel. And that began what's become an important and cherished friendship from my side. It was interesting. I was talking to my daughter, I think it was 2 days ago. Yeah, 2 days ago. And we were talking about public debate and argument. And I mentioned John as a model to me of the kind of person in the arena of public debate and persuasion. And one of the things I admire about him and why his book is so good is the rigor of the arguments, the nuance, and the fact that John is a person who cares about truth and is seeking it, even if it's imperfect for all of us. So this book is extremely important. And I think it'll be one of those books that'll be remembered years from now, because it diagnosed the problem the right way and actually offers some solutions too. It's easier to diagnose problems than offer solutions, but this book does both. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, John, and just begin a conversation, which some of the people viewing can join in and Knapp as well. But one thing I suppose is on my mind is, does this surprise you in terms of the fact that this epistemic crisis is hitting America? It seems that America's largely been immune to these kinds of things, not completely, but often it had been left to the fringes, and these institutions that you talked about and norms held up. So we seem, at least in my experience, my maybe the closest parallel, or one of the closest parallels, would be the Civil War, lead up to the Civil War. But this strikes me as unusual for America. So I'm wondering, A, if you agree with that, and B, what is it about this moment that you think left America susceptible to this sort of pincer movement from both the left and the right in terms of the assault on classical liberalism and truth?
Yes, Pete, thank you. I do agree with you. This moment is not completely without precedent, because we saw something like it, though quite different in its execution in the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War. The forces that favored secession and war used a sophisticated propaganda campaign to basically wallpaper the South with pamphlets and other propaganda saying that the North was going to sweep down and the blacks were going, free all the slaves to rape all the white women. And they were very successful in fomenting war. And I don't have to tell you that ended quite badly. But we haven't seen anything like that since then. And in fact, the Constitution of Knowledge held up so well for so long that I think we let our guard drop. We just naturally assumed that America is not a place where someone like Vladimir Putin could unleash those kinds of tactics and get anywhere. We had assumed that the mainstream media at least would. I think we underestimated both the reach and the tactics of conservative media. We certainly didn't see social media coming, and that turns out to be brilliantly designed for disinformation and misinformation, because basically it's an advertising medium. It just wants people to click regardless of truth, and it turns out what people click on is outrage, conspiracy theories, and the like. And we also thought, or at least I thought, that the American public would be more resistant to just conspiratorial, can I say bullshit? I don't think we understood how manipulable all of us human beings are. I think we
just on that question, because that strikes me as quite true. Are we more manipulable in the last 5 or so years? Is there something that had happened that created the conditions? Because I'll grant you the social media, it's a kind of interesting counterfactual, which is if you took social media out of the equation, if we were 25 years ago, would we still be in an epistemic crisis? Were there other factors that sort of created the conditions for both these movements? But I agree with you, which is the attack on the right and the Trumpian moment, the MAGA moment, is most, I think, alarming. That's what I have a hard time wrapping my mind, or not wrapping my mind around, but just understanding analytically. Did something happen where the public gave up on their fidelity to truth? Was it less attractive? Were there other forces and currents at play that made us particularly susceptible, apart from social media, which I grant you is a big deal?
Yeah, so it's a perfect storm. I'm not one who blames it all on social media. If anything, social media is overrated.
Interesting.
In its role. It seems to be my reading of the literature. Social media isn't the main driver of disinformation. It's not even number 2. It's number 3. Number 2 is cable news. And number 1 is politicians and political parties, the great traditional drivers of disinformation since day one. So no, our brains didn't change, of course. We've always been very vulnerable to these tactics. Our vulnerability increased because of a kind of perfect storm of things. If anything, Pete, this is overdetermined. You can come up with, in fact, more explanations than we need. One, of course, is social media, which we mentioned, but another is the increasingly deep polarization in society. Polarization and propagandization go together, because the more divided you are, the more you hate the other side, so the more vulnerable you are to conspiracy theories and the kind of propaganda that Trump's doing when he says, liberate Michigan, and polarizes a COVID response. The goal of propaganda is to further divide the society. That weakens it. It makes it more vulnerable to kleptocrats, dictators, whatever. So you've got a self-feeding cycle where the more polarized we get, the more propaganda vulnerable we are, the more propagandized we get, the more polarized we get, and that's what we see. So that's a factor. A second is institutional, and I know that you know this, we can't overstate this. Something fundamentally changed about the Republican Party, not just with Trump. I trace it back to Pat Buchanan's run for president in the 90s, and then Sarah Palin's rise in 2008. But then turbocharged under Trump, which is the group of Americans that are particularly extreme in certain aspects began to consolidate within the Republican Party. I think of them as George Wallace voters. And that over time, adding to conservative media and adding to social media, turned the Republican Party increasingly friendly into just tearing down the barriers that we had relied on in political behavior to prevent just outright rampant lying. So the institutional change in the political parties, and specifically the Republican Party, is also a very big deal. And then fourth, on the left, primarily, there's this ideological component, which is the rise of doctrines like safe spaces, words that wound, the notion that if I offend someone, I'm violating I'm violating their human rights. This leads to the whole regime that we see of reporting on campuses, inquisitions, investigations, and so forth. So add those things up, you get a significantly more vulnerable society.
That's interesting. And when you think about how to approach this, and your book gives recommendations, and you touched on some of them today, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on this. Excuse me. And we had a little bit of a conversation before we went on the air, the three of us, about this. But John, how do you think about the approach, either tactically or strategically or both, in terms of the defense of truth and rebuilding truth? For example, if you're dealing with MAGA world, and that is now a large part, it's a majority part of one of the two most influential and important parties in America. Do you think about reaching those people? Do you think about disaggregating MAGA world and thinking there's some people who are persuadable and some people who are not? And how do you deal with, I mean, I've had experiences with people in actually very different realms, not very different, but different realms. One is the notion that the election was stolen and the events of January 6th. And then the other is the pandemic, right? So I had a conversation with a friend in last summer, and we were talking, and he was absolutely convinced that hydroxychloroquine would cure COVID. And it didn't matter when I asked him a question of why he would think that entire institutions like NIH, people like Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, who have devoted their life to healing people, would reject it if the evidence was so overwhelming. The response I got was follow the money, that there was this web of conspiracy theories in pharmaceuticals in China. And this is a person who is a thoughtful person in other regards, a fine person, the kind of person you would want as your neighbor. But we had exchanges, and he would just send me links to conspiracy websites, and there was no way to penetrate that. So I'm wondering, when you think about socially, society-wise, or even individually, how do you break through? Does it have to be contained? Do you try and reach people? If so, how do you do it individually when you encounter these people? Or do you think about it just institutionally and think we have to? And one other thing I'll say in this is just a complication of it, because as you know, fact-checking lies often doesn't work. And in some respects, depending on which social science studies you believe, fact-checking can actually perpetuate the problem, because it sort of elevates the lie and it sticks in people's brain and sort of validates the lie. So, this is all very complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and a frustrating thing to me about explaining this book, talking about it, is this isn't one of those situations where you can give the nice 3 bullet point answer, repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and do 2 other things and you're done. It's not like that at all. What we're instead talking about is institutions and individuals throughout society in whatever realm they work in, whether it's law, journalism. There are things that they can do in their institutions to make them more resilient, more truth-based, to increase their credibility. But it's going to differ all across society. So addressing more directly what you said, the most common question I get is some version of the conspiracy-minded uncle. Which is, how do I how do I change this person's mind? And the answer is usually you can't. But the evidence is that what works best is to express curiosity and genuine interest, to build a relationship with that person, not to just throw facts at them. And that over time, this is a very high touch process, but over time it can get people to think again. Not everyone. But the good news is you don't have to reach everyone. We've never reached everyone. We've always had in America a society that was rife with conspiracy theories. What you have to do, use the word contain. That's a good word. Another way to think about it is a field that's pretty new and quite interesting is cognitive immunology. these viruses, these intellectual viruses, conspiracy theories will always be out there. There will always be incentives to believe them. You know, they explain so much, so magically. They allow us to feel that we have secret knowledge that makes us privileged and special, all of that. So it's going to be out there, but can you build buffers in society? People like trusted institutions, trusted individuals who can slow the spread. Can you re-engineer social media platforms so that they'll be less friendly to impulsive shares, for example, and trolling? Social media companies are working on product designs that will do that. Twitter has implemented some. Can you slow people down before they repeat conspiracy theories online and elsewhere? Just make them think for a second. So people are thinking in terms of how can you slow down the spread of these things and create some time for our rational brains, our slower brains to respond. And I think that's the right way to think about it. And remember, you don't have to convince everyone, you don't want to. What you need to do is create enough people in society so that you can have some conspiracy theories out there, but they won't take over your governing institutions. Finally, this will sound partisan. I apologize for that. I don't see an alternative. I'm center right. I have admired and voted for many conservatives and Republicans. I think nothing else will work until the Republican Party is backed away from its full-on embrace of Russian-style information warfare. But if that happens, then we got a good shot.
Okay. Let me ask one personal question, then Nap, I will turn it over to you and questions from the audience. But you write in the book that we rationalize back. You're basing this in part on our mutual friend John Haidt, and his was a social psychologist, and he wrote a book several years ago called The Righteous Mind. John is a wonderful and terrifically intelligent and wise person. And in the course of discussing his work and your own thoughts, you write, we rationalize backward from our emotions and intuitions, yet we will swear that we are reasoning forward from our policy views. I'm just interested in how John Rauch approaches this issue. How do you, with all of your understanding of all of the traps and the tricks that our own mind plays, the rationalizations, the blindness that we have, how do you, as someone who honestly is dedicated to finding truth and searching for truth, how does that work in your process, knowing that you have a propensity to rationalize backwards, and you have emotions and intuitions, and you're in search of confirming what you already believe?
Yeah, it's such an important question, because we all assume that we're not biased, but the other guy is. And it turns out that being a person of high IQ doesn't help with that situation, may make it worse, because it just turbocharges our ability to rationalize what we want to believe. So there's two levels to that. One is my personal intellectual hygiene, which is stuff like I try to read fairly broadly. I try to look at things I know I'm going to disagree with, realizing that I'll have to gnash my teeth. If somebody says something that seems to me offensive, I try to dial my reaction down to annoyance instead of up to outrage. I try to remember that I might be wrong and stick to the protocols of the Constitution of Knowledge, which is to expose my views to criticism, to see what the best arguments against it are, and to try to refute the best arguments and not the easiest arguments. And more, toleration, pluralism, these are the values of the Constitution of Knowledge, and I try to stick to them. But that said, I also understand, Pete, as I think you probably do also, that the personal probity and personal effort, as heroic as it might be, only gets you so far, because we are so vulnerable to these unseen cognitive biases and tribal influences. So it's also important to try to attach ourselves to institutions that will help us stay on the straight and narrow. And in my case, that was being trained as a mainstream journalist. It's being associated with the Atlantic and especially with the Brookings Institution. In your case, it's having worked in government with responsible people, being at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But by embedding ourselves in the institutions that are committed to the constitutional knowledge, that helps shape us into people who are willing to follow those rules and norms and who associate with others who can reinforce that. I'd be curious at some point, I know we want to go to Q&A, but if you had a minute to dilate just a second on your views of whether the Republican Party, well, first, am I correct in my diagnosis? And second, is it retrievable?
I think you are correct in your diagnosis. I mean, I think it is retrievable. The question is, practically speaking, will it be retrieved, and what's the time frame that we're looking at? My hope and I guess my disposition is that in the end, the truth will out, and that, to use a phrase that Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident, later president, used, you can only live within a lie for some period of time, that ultimately the human fulfillment, in almost every regard, is found in truth. And that if you base your life or your party or your country on a lie, ultimately it has to come crashing down, almost definitionally so. But in the short term, I'm quite worried about the Republican Party. My view is that the party is in some important respects more radicalized now than it was during the Trump presidency. That unlike a cult of personality, which when the cult leader passes from the scene, the cult dies, or at least diminishes in its power. That's not happening. I think one of the frustrations that I've had, John and Knapp, is that during the Trump era, far too many people that knew better didn't speak out. Sometimes they defended Trump, sometimes they went sotto voce, they went silent. And what they either didn't understand or didn't want to understand is that when you engage with, perpetrate, play footsie with conspiracy theories and lies at the dimension that we were talking about, it would have a massive deforming effect on the base of the party. And so I had conversations with people after Trump lost, some of whom were hoping that I would be less critical of the Republican Party, that it would snap back, that it would go back to the old, conservative liberal binary choice, and the Republican Party would become sane again. And that wasn't, in retrospect, a reasonable assumption, because I think the people did not understand the deformation that's happened. I don't think it's the political class that's driven this as much as it's been the base of the party, and the political class, lacking courage, has indulged this. But unfortunately, it's been a somewhat winning proposition. It's been losing too. I mean, Trump lost the presidency, but the Republicans are quite likely to win back the House. And now you've got a lot of mini Trumps running around, some of them whom are smarter than him. I'm not sure that they have the malicious intuition that he does. He's a genius in some respects, some very dangerous respects, certainly not intellectually, but just his ability as a master propagandist. I mean, I think he's really on the level of a Putin-like figure. Maybe even more so, because he pulled it off in this country rather than Russia, and there's a really willing audience for it. And so I think there's a lot to unwind. It's painful for me, having been a Republican my entire life. I mean, I was always, my order of priorities would be, Christian, conservative, and Republican. I always felt like the Republican Party was mostly an instrument or a vehicle for certain ideals, certain principles I believed in. So it wasn't that hard for me to be critical of the Republican Party. Nonetheless, it was, I served in 3 Republican administrations. I served in a Republican White House for 7 years, and to have seen a party that I thought did some real good over the decades embrace Trump so thoroughly, and the way it's discrediting conservatism. I don't for a moment think what we're seeing is conservatism. I think it's nativism, populism, a lot of ugly stuff. So I think for now they just have to be confronted, and in the ways that you speak about. I think they have to be defeated in almost every case. I mean, there may be some exceptions here and there. There's a wonderful Republican governor in Maryland, and some people believe that Glenn Youngkin in Virginia was a positive sign. But even Youngkin, during the lead up to the primary, had to at least indulge the Stop the Steal campaign. So I'm really worried about it, and I think it's an act now of civic patriotism. And I think people who love the Republican Party and conservatism are the ones who have the most obligation to speak up, because it is the things that they would presumably most care about that's being destroyed. And that's why I never understood, or I guess I understood, but why it always bothered me that the people who had the most investment in the sanity and the decency of the Republican Party have gone along with this.
That's beautifully put. I'll just a quick addendum to that is if there's been something I've learned out of all of this, it's, we Americans are very individualist in our mindset, and we tend to overlook the influence and importance of our institutional setting. And it turns out you can take someone who does not have a truth-seeking mindset, who's very biased and maybe motivated by other things, but if you put them in a context where what they need to do to get ahead in life, say get that master's degree, get the promotion in journalism, is follow the rules diligently of fact checking, of being reality based, of all the things that we do, no ad hominem attacks. Those values will sink in and create a social order in which even people who aren't particularly well motivated by nature will become very good truth seekers. So I kind of knew that, but what astounded me is that you could take people who are decent and are truth oriented and really want to do the right thing. If you put them in a corrupt institutional setting, where all the incentives, for example, to having your own successful talk radio show, or being a host on cable TV, or winning a Republican primary, if you switch all the incentives to lie as much as you want, make the base happy, that's what they'll do, regardless, in many cases, not all cases, thank God, but in many cases, regardless of the amount of integrity that they bring to that institutional setting. And that's been kind of mind-bending.
Yeah, there's a line that John Kennedy used. He said there's a reason Profiles in Courage was a slim volume. Knapp, you want to go to some of the questions, or any questions you have?
Yeah, we do have some good questions coming in. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, though. So there seems to be a disconnect between what you've told us today and what's in the book, in terms of a lot of your advice seems geared more towards the liberal left than the MAGA right. And then today you tell us the biggest problem is actually the MAGA right. Is that due to the lag between the time that you finished writing the book and events since then?
Yep, you got it. The book was mostly finished before the election. I thought there was a 2/3 chance that Joe Biden would be president by the time the book came out in June of 2021, and that the Republican Party, Trump would be primarily off the scene, and the Republican Party would have reshaped itself back in a more normal direction. So I didn't want to write a book that was already out of date on publication day. And boy, did I, as Pete's former boss would say, boy, did I underestimate that situation. So yes, if I were writing the book now, the emphasis would be different.
If I could just add very quickly, Knapp, I don't think John believes, and I don't believe, that the threat to the left has reduced. I'm quite worried about this. And I think the problem is located mostly in the academy, which is very, very dangerous, because the academy is supposed to be the home of reason and debate. And the idea that that would be the place where this chilling effect that John refers to is taking place really has far-reaching cultural consequences and ultimately political consequences. And John, just to plug him one more time, wrote a book, I think it was in '93, Kindly Inquisitors, which is a very prescient book. I mean, it anticipated a lot of what we're seeing. So the threat on the left is very real. And if you talk to journalists, even sort of center left or liberal leaning journalists, there's a real fear in newsrooms about this woke culture. So this attack on truth is not located in one place. I do think, just to build on what John said, it's not that the threat from the left has reduced. It's that November 3rd and particularly January 6th changed the game. It was a kind of CAT scan of the level of depravity and corruption, intellectual and moral corruption, that had taken place. And that, I think, is why John, if he were write the book today, would probably shift the emphasis a bit.
Yeah. And I would add to that, the liberal left also provides ammunition to the MAGA right. So,
Exactly. Yeah, there's this kind of nasty synergy.
yeah. The first question was from Daniel Bennett. He says, thanks, Jonathan. You mentioned the whole of society response that's needed to combat these problems. But with these problems increasingly sorting along ideological partisan lines, how do concerned folks go about calling out these problems without being dismissed as, quote, the other side?
Well, some people will use the other side. That's just inevitable. But I try to emphasize the importance of what I think of as reality allies. And this takes just a brief paragraph to explain. So bear with me. One of the most famous cognitive social psychology experiments ever. It takes 8 people, it puts them in the room, it gives them a super obvious question. It just says, which of the 3 lines on the right is the same length as the line on the left? And it makes that so obvious that no one ever gets it wrong in an individual context. And it asks the 8 people in the room that question. But there's a catch, which is 7 of the people in the room are actors, and they all give the identical incorrect answer. What does the 8th person, who's the actual experimental subject, do? Well, a third of the time, they belie the evidence of their own eyes and give the group answer. And only 25 people in this 25% of people in this situation invariably stick to reality. Most of us are vulnerable to this kind of social coercion and persuasion. If that's what the group is doing, we will tend to conform, not just in what we say, but what we believe. Take that same experiment, do exactly the same thing. You've got the 7 actors, you've got the 1 subject, change one small parameter. Now 6 of the actors give the identical wrong answer. 1 of the actors gives the right answer. Suddenly, the experimental subject is much likelier to go with reality. The groupthink factor drops to 5 to 10%. And that's just because 1 other person in the room spoke up. So there are reality allies in society and in the Republican Party that provide anchors that keep saying, regardless of the amount of stuff that's thrown at them, here is reality, I can prove it. They are stubbornly making their arguments. One of those is a friend of mine, a man named Stephen Richer, the Maricopa County Recorder in Phoenix, Arizona, has started a PAC to push back against Stop the Steal. He has put out documents of papers disproving all of the claims that the election was stolen. And he is rallying other Republicans. These are the kind of islands which seem small at first, but you can build out from them. That's the role of dissidents, for example, in the Soviet Union. Remember, people hate to live in an epistemically manipulated environment where they don't know what's true. They don't know who to trust. They're just surrounded by shit. That's the problem with Steve Bannon's model. It's like living in a toxically polluted environment, India, China on a bad day. People don't like that. So keeping those reality anchors, being a reality anchor, that is important. If you do that, you can build on that. It's not that you necessarily win, but that's what gives you the fighting chance.
Yeah.
Sorry about the long answer. There's just a lot to unpack there.
Pete, you've dealt with this before, right? You're accused of being a communist now because you criticize Trump. Is that right?
Yeah, it's I'm not sure communist, but I'd say a couple things about that. It's interesting, and John knows this probably better than I because of the human psychology. I should say, by the way, and I might write an essay on this. I've learned more about politics from psychologists, social psychologists over the last 10 years than political science by a long shot. And I don't think it's possible to understand this political moment, probably politics in general, but particularly this political moment, without understanding human psychology. If you don't understand that, this stuff just leaves you at sea, and it doesn't make sense. It at least gives you the ability to begin to make some kind of order out of what's happening, and then I think come up with a game plan. But my point is that there's a special kind of energy and often a special kind of anger directed at people that they feel are traitorous. So somebody who was once a Republican or is a conservative and a critic of Trump catalyzes a response among MAGA world that is more intense, more angry, more enraged than it would be if Nancy Pelosi or AOC did, because the assumption is, well, they didn't know better, and you should know better. That you're not defending your team when it's under attack. But that stuff honestly doesn't bother me a tremendous amount. My stand on Trump, and I was very, very early. I actually wrote a warning on Trump in the New York Times 3 weeks after he had entered the race. It was July of 2015, called President Donald Trump, ? Just say no, because I had, I think, some understanding about how dangerous he was. But I never had a hesitation that was, from my perspective, given my set of beliefs, the way I interpreted reality, that standing up against him was important to do. The other thing I'd say, Knapp, is if you had asked, say, maybe the 20 people pre-Trump that I felt like knew me best and loved me most and had walked the journey with me, I would say the overwhelming number of people in my case would have expected me to say what I've said, would have been disappointed in me if I had said anything else other than what I've said. And most of all, I would be disappointed in myself. And I have a community of people who are supportive, and John is one of them. I mean, John and I exchange emails all the time with other writers and thinkers, often just trying to check each other, trying to say, what do you think about this? What are we missing? But it's also a community that cares about, I would say, a lot of this. C.S. Lewis talked about some lovers look eye to eye, friends look shoulder to shoulder, seeing the sort of same reality. And we all need that. And I feel like I've got some of that, so that helps a lot.
We have a question here about Neil Postman. This is from Austin Gravely. It's hard not to see what's happening as the fallout of Neil Postman's work in the 80s with television. Where does media literacy fit in all of this as part of the solution?
Should I take that, or?
Yeah, you take it, John. That's right in your wheelhouse.
It fits. I don't think it's a big part of the answer, but it's part of it. It turns out that education in the form of civics education, which we've shamefully neglected to our great cost, but also critical thinking education, media literacy education, these things actually are helpful. There's no magic bullets, but especially some of the European countries, some of the Baltic countries, for example, are having good success with helping students understand how to get online and distinguish better and worse sources. And in fact, often now young people are much better than their elders at doing that. There's some studies that suggest that critical thinking skills can be taught, and certainly taught better than they are now. So all of those things about improving individual resilience are important and are meaningful.
We have a question here from Andrew Eastman. I'm sorry, it's long. I'm going to try to consolidate it. Asking about Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. He says, I would have thought that in the political arena, truth tellers like Liz and Adam would be better received by open-minded members of their party than Democrats, but it appears to be the opposite. They are shunned even more when they try to get to the facts of January 6th.
That one's for you, Pete.
Yeah, sure. Well, if there was a new Profiles in Courage book, they would make the chapter would be devoted to them. Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney have been really, I would say, heroic figures. Liz, in particular, has been outspoken, and her situation was more complicated. She was in the House leadership. And she was stripped of that. And she comes from a family. Of course, her father was vice president and was an extremely influential figure in the history of the modern Republican Party. And so for her to break with her party over a matter of principle is extremely admirable. Why the intensity of the reaction against them? I think it is because they're speaking truth, and they're speaking truth from what people who they were within the camp itself. And I think that the people like Kevin McCarthy and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert and really all of them, I mean, even with a spectrum, even people who are not as crazed as those people are, hate the fact that what they are doing is being called out. It's being named, and they're ashamed of it. So the people who believe in the conspiracy theories are angered by it because they believe it and they think that these charges are lies, which is, of course, a total inversion of reality. But then there's a different and larger group of Republicans who know what Liz and Adam are saying is actually true, and they hate them for it. Why can't you keep your mouth shut? Don't you understand that we've got a chance to win back the House, that power matters? And then they've convinced themselves that if we have the levers of power, the legislative branch, the presidency, all of the good that we can do, can't you set aside these minor transgressions about norms? Can't you let your obsessions go? So I think that is a lot of it. And Liz Cheney is, I've worked with Liz. I've known her for a number of years. She's impressive. She's tough. I knew she was tough, but she's even tougher and more admirable than I thought. And you can say that as a person who doesn't even believe in a lot of what Liz Cheney believes in terms of her political philosophy. She and Adam Kinzinger have stood up and spoken truth to power, and they're having an effect. And Lord, God bless them for doing that.
I'd just add briefly, it's a very profound answer, Pete, something I hadn't really thought of in quite that way. I'd only add something also profound that George Will said, as he's inclined to do, is that the Republican Party now is an institution whose leaders are frightened. They're frightened of Trump. They're frightened of their base. And when people become frightened, they circle their wagons, they enter a defensive posture, and their first priority is to eject anything that looks like a threat. And so that's the mentality that they have right now.
That's related to a question that Terry Heaton asked, and I think we only have a minute left, so it's a good question to end on. And I think Terry, you won't mind if I kind of rephrase it a little bit, but he's asking about what's the center of American politics these days. And I've thought about this a lot recently because there was a time before Trump I never would have described myself as a centrist, but these days I'm like, no, I'm center right, I guess. So what is the center these days? What does it mean to be in the center of American politics today?
Well, I'll let Pete have the last word on that, but I'm guessing we'll say something similar. My answer to that has changed over the last 10 years because I used to think of the center as a policy place, as a place that rejected kind of the extremes of the left and right in terms of policy ideas and ideology. That's changed over the course of the woke revolution and especially the MAGA revolution. I now think of the center as the place where, regardless of policy preferences, people cluster who are fundamentally dedicated to the ideals of the constitution of knowledge, liberal democracy, the values and traditions that have made our society what it is. And that's not about policy. It's not about tax rates or immigration levels or the environment. And I increasingly now think of the extremes as people who, again, regardless of the specifics of ideology, are not committed to those fundamental democratic and liberal norms and principles. And that increasingly the way the future has to look is that newly defined center, that liberal center, small L liberal center, has got to increasingly cohere, see itself as a unit, and become the heart of American politics. But Pete, the last word on this.
Yeah, sure. You're exactly right, John. Your view and mine are aligned in precisely the same way. I don't think about this, Knapp, in terms of center. First, in terms of public policy, I've never been in a period in my experience in politics where public policy has mattered less than it does right now. People aren't interested in it. The bases of the two parties largely aren't, but mostly on the right. And I don't think that this moment could be understood as differences over immigration or tax policy or policy toward Ukraine and so forth. I think the central issue facing the Republic right now is truth and falsity. And there, I don't look for the center. There's this notion that the center is a kind of, everything is sort of, there's equidistance between the two points, and somehow if you get to that equidistant point, that's where you should be. That's not what we're talking about here. This is a challenge between truth and falsity, between truth and lies. And I'm not looking to be in the center between the truth and the lies. I actually think people need to be on the side of the truth. That's what matters now. We have to recover truth, because if we don't do that, if we don't have a common set of facts and an allegiance, more or less, to some kind of sense of what's objectively true, all of this other stuff isn't going to matter. And this stuff can unravel. I'm not predicting that it will, but it can. And the membrane separating, civilization and barbarism, as it's been said before, is thinner than we think. And I think we've thought for a long time that America was immune, or at least I probably thought it was more immune to these kinds of things than it turns out that it did. So that's what we need. Often when people, I think, use the term center, what they really mean is moderation. And there, if you're talking about moderation of temperament, that's a deeply conservative view, and one I've long respected and held and continue to hold. But this is a debate that's different than, in my estimation, than we've had before, and more important than before. And people have to choose which side that they're going to be on.
All right, Jonathan Rauch and Pete Wehner, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the participants who joined to watch, or if you're watching now and recording, and pick up the book. There's the cover. The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. Thank you. Have a great Christmas, everybody.